Okay, it's 1 minute past the hour of 2. Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's event, Mayoral Elections, 2 days to go. As the title says, in less than 48 hours, 10 places across the country will be going to the polls to elect their Metro Mayor, some for the first time, some for the sixth time, and some for some variation in between. At the end of the polling, we will have about 50% of England's population covered by a Metro Mayor. So not insignificant as to what's going on in those places, but also the broader story and bunch of issues that it tells us about the country at large. Today, we're going to just have a catch up with 2 days to go, find out what's been going on in the various places. How should we think about what's been going on? What the issues have been, what some of the different approaches by the candidates has been, and then essentially we'll broaden out and ask some bigger questions about what does it tell us about devolution more broadly and issues such as that. And we've got an esteemed panel to take us through all of those issues. We've got Dave Hill, editor and founder of On London. We've got Kate Knowles, editor and founder of Birmingham Dispatch, and we've got Rob Parsons, editor of the Northern Agenda. So we will try to cover most places. We'll tend to focus on some places more than others, particularly where there is more contention or the polls suggest that the fight is particularly tight. So first off, Kate, let's come to you. You've been particularly focused on West Midlands. Just say a little bit about general senses about how busy the sort of election period has been, how active the various candidates have been, and then we'll get into some of the issues. But just give us a general sense as to high wattage, low wattage, lots of enthusiasm, no enthusiasm. What would you say, Kate?
Yeah, it seems to have been pretty energetic. I mean, the sheer number of hustings that they've attended is just phenomenal. But some obviously more present than others, and not everyone's made every event. I'd say Andy Street and Richard Parker, unsurprisingly, so that's the Tory and the Labour candidate, have been the most visible. There's a slightly erroneous candidate, an independent called Ahmed Yaqub, who is known for his big TikTok following, and he's standing on a very pro-Palestine ticket, and he's kind of a little bit more erratic, I think.
Interesting. Okay, well, we'll come back to this. So it's interesting that the two main parties, the two main candidates, have been the most busy, most energetic. Dave, you've certainly been energetic and high wattage in your coverage of what's going on in London. Have the candidates, the many and the wide variety of them, have they also been energetic? How would you sort of characterise what's been going on in the election period in London?
It's interesting because it's sort of all rather paradoxical. There's a sense in which at one level there is a sense of it's all a bit boring because Sadiq Khan, who's going for his third term, has been given very, very large opinion poll leads. And even though we've seen a couple recently which have been narrower, he's still in double figures up ahead. And all the evidence we have, including precedent, suggests that he is going to win, probably with a bit to spare. But on the other hand, last time in 2021, we had a very similar picture in terms of polling. And when Sadiq Khan and his team have been saying right from the start, there is no room for complacency. This is a tight two-horse race. Now, they've got an interest in saying that sort of thing and talking it up. But there is genuine anxiety here that there is a lot of voter fatigue with Sadiq, having been around for 8 years, and his own people have said this to me quite openly, that they're worried that they're not finding much enthusiasm for him on the doorstep. And by contrast, the Conservative candidate, Susan Hall, her sort of Tory base support in London, which is really only around sort of 25–30%, is nonetheless probably much more revved up and riled up than Sadiq's is, generally speaking. So that, from the Sadiq Khan point of view, is the worry. So he's really been trying to make it busier, to address the busyness question, make it as busy as he can, because they are genuinely worried about apathy, fatigue, differential turnout. You know, they're not ruling out. I'm not ruling out a complete shock. I'm expecting him to win. I'm not completely ruling out a shock result.
Yeah, that's interesting. Rob, I'll come to you in a second. Kate, just to jump back on that, do you get a similar sense in the West Mids that, you know, part of the busyness is for the candidates to try and drum, you know, they see this as, or they're worried about turnout and apathy amongst their electorate, and that's partly why they've been as busy as they've been?
I think that's always probably an element, because voter turnout for these kinds of elections is never that high. It's always difficult as well, because you're so in it as a journalist, like, to try and remove yourself and see it as someone who's just not really that engaged. But I think there is some truth in it. But I think because it's such a close race, that has actually drummed up a little bit more interest than maybe it wouldn't have. Like, we've had a little bit more national press interest, I think, because it's this very quite heated competition.
Yeah.
So my perception is that people are a little bit more engaged. Whether that translates to more votes at the polling stations, I don't know. The other thing to mention is that while all of the councils in the West Midlands, apart from Birmingham, are having local elections, I think that will impact the turnout as well, because I think often, you know, to voters, you'll just be more aware there are elections happening if your local councillors are coming and knocking on your door a lot during their campaigns. Then I think that will affect the turnout in Birmingham, which is likely to have an impact, probably more likely on Labour.
Yes, yeah, well, that's interesting. Yeah, we'll come back to that about, you know, to coincides with local elections. Right, Rob, you've got a big task because you're covering essentially large parts of the North for us. We've got 3 elections in Yorkshire. We've obviously got Tees Valley. We've got the North East, and then that's not covering the Liverpool or the Greater Manchester areas as well, which we're going to take as foregone that Labour are going to win. It's only a question of how much they win. We might be wrong on that, but we'll see. Let's start with Tees Valley. How busy has the Tees Valley debate and conversation been?
Well, as you say, Andrew, yeah, so there's 7 mayoral elections in the north of England. Yeah, the ones that I'm most interested in are North East, Tees Valley, and York and North Yorkshire, which are all interesting for different reasons. Tees Valley, I think if you judge it based on activity on Facebook by the Tory mayor of the Tees Valley, Ben Houchin, or the tweets that I'm seeing amongst the people I follow in that part of the world on Twitter, it's very busy. I think as we get closer to election day, it's quite a tight race between Ben Houchin, who is the Conservative mayor, trying to get re-elected for a second time, and his Labour opponent, Chris McEwen, who is the deputy leader of Darlington Council. Until quite recently, they were sort of neck and neck. There was a poll out last night which suggests that Ben Houchin is now 7 points ahead. But as the elections have got closer, the press releases and the social media videos have been flying out ever more regularly. And Ben Houchin particularly has gone into overdrive on Facebook, which I think is his sort of method of choice to reach his electorate, with videos attacking his opponent. So there's that going on. To what extent people in the pubs and clubs of Middlesbrough and Stockton and Redcar are paying loads and loads of attention to this, I am not sure. I did see a piece in the Times which suggested people still aren't getting particularly engaged with this race, and which is surprising, really, because I'd say it is one of the more interesting ones. So yeah, it's hard to know how engaged the populace are, but from a journalist point of view, there's been a lot to write about in the Tees Valley.
Okay, so if that's Tees Valley, do the North East, where essentially it's a former Labour mayor competing with a would-be Labour mayor to be the mayor of the North East, which is a sort of half of the old and half of the new. So just give us a sense as to the busyness of what's going on in the North East.
Yeah, it is a bit confusing because there's the North East region. The Tees Valley is part of the North East region, but there is a separate mayoral election for the first Metro mayor of the northeast, which is basically the north and south of the Tyne. So Northumberland up to the Scottish borders, down to Barnard Castle in County Durham, an area of about 2 million people. And yes, as you say, it's a less conventional race. I think it's not so easy to fit into a sort of traditional red versus blue narrative. So the two front runners are Kim McGuinness, who is Labour's candidate, the police and crime commissioner for Northumbria. She's had a lot of backing from the party, and she appears to be neck and neck, or very slightly ahead of Jamie Driscoll, who is the former Labour mayor for the north of Tyne, which is a smaller area where there was a smaller devolution deal done a few years ago. He is standing as an independent. He wanted to be Labour's candidate. Labour blocked him from the shortlist because they didn't like the fact that he'd appeared on stage with Ken Loach. So Jamie Driscoll quit the party. He's now running as an independent, and he's really sort of going big on the whole independent spirit, fighting against the machine kind of vibe. He's got quite a big crowd-funded operation behind him, and he's he's really playing on the fact that he's going up against this big Labour machine, and it appears to be working quite well for him. He's a couple of points back from Kim McGuinness, if the polls are to be believed.
Okay, very good. And do Yorks and North Yorks, which is one of the new ones, and give us a sense as to how busy that's been there.
Yeah, well, I mean, I must admit, until relatively recently, like this week, I feel like people weren't paying a huge amount of attention to York and North Yorkshire because they assumed it would be a pretty easy Conservative victory, because it's a very rural patch. It's kind of the most rural of all the devolved areas in the north of England. It encompasses a lot of market towns and small villages and the Yorkshire Dales and the North York Moors, as well as the city of York. And so everyone assumed that the Conservative candidate, Keane Duncan, who is a local councillor, also an ex-journalist, still in his 20s, so he would be the youngest Metro mayor to be elected, sickeningly young at the age of only 29. Everyone assumed that he would win because it's a very Tory-dominated area. But the latest, from what I'm hearing, that race is actually neck and neck, and Labour think that they might win. And I've been speaking to a couple of Conservative locals in North Yorkshire who say it's going to be very tight, and that what they're getting back on the doorstep is not good at all. So it could be there could be a bit of a shock on the cards in North Yorkshire, which would be quite a surprise.
Very good, very good. Okay, have a rest for a minute, Rob. Come back to you. You can throw in other thoughts in a second. Dave, start us off with so obviously you three are all massively interested in the mayoral elections. We are massively interested in the mayoral elections, but we're slightly weird in that sort of sense. We're not necessarily good weather vanes for the rest of the population, or even for the media. But say something about the extent to which the media, local and national, have been paying much attention to the London context, Dave.
Well, the Evening Standard, of course, is the sort of large established newspaper for the Greater London area, and it's been very interesting to me watching them, because for most of their past they have been very much behind Conservative candidates. There was one year where they decided that Ken Livingstone was bound to win, so they might as well put in a word for him. But basically it is a Tory leaning paper. This time they've been very, very kind of BBC balanced, and from my point of view, it's been, as a Londoner, I think that's a good thing. I think that's the right way standard to approach things. Although yesterday they did run a really appalling crime piece, which a sort of an attack piece on Sadiq Khan, which was very disappointing. Otherwise they've been pretty good, and I think you can sense this is a terrible journalist failing. You can sense them trying to create a contest when a lot of people feel that there really isn't one. Yeah. So there's a little bit of that going on. So there's that, and then in terms of national coverage, again, it's always interesting. as a sort of London specialist to see how the national media cover what goes on in London. And of course, one of the challenges for, I don't know if others feel the same way, one of the challenges for me as a London specialist is not to get too irritated by the way the Nationals cover what's going on, because they don't know anything. They don't really understand how it works.
Yeah, come and cover it, but talk to me first.
Yes, why are they saying all these stupid things?
Right? Yeah.
But I have my blood pressure tablets here, so I've been taking those regularly. Again, I think it's really going back to what I said before, that there has been a sense with the Nationals, I think, that it's not very interesting, that it's Sadiq Khan again and he's going to win. So there hasn't been a great deal of coverage. In previous mayoral elections, the one that got the most attention nationally, historically, and also the highest ever turnout in the London mayoral election was 2008, which was the first Ken Livingstone Boris Johnson battle.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of national coverage of that. This time, really, it's been quite patchy, quite a lot of why is the Tory candidate so terrible kind of pieces. A bit of that. The BBC did have a proper debate between the four leading candidates, which was on national telly, and was a successful event, I would say. So there was that level of seriousness, which is good. So it's been kind of patchy, a sense as sort of journalists were terrible people, we hate to be bored, we want there to be excitement and stuff. And there is a feeling that it's, for the reasons I've already said, that it isn't that exciting this time. So I don't care, I carry on doing what I do anyway. So
good man. Okay. Let's move to, the West Midlands contest is definitely exciting, right? My impression, at least, obviously your thought is there's been a fair bit of national interest in the West Midlands context, but almost all of it has been written about from a national context, which is essentially, what does this tell us about the state of the Labour Party versus the state of the Conservative Party at the national level? I don't know if that's your take in it as well, and what would you draw from that?
Yeah, Nationals are gonna national, aren't they? So I guess that's to be expected. But yeah, I think you're probably right. I think there is the other angle though that's quite interesting, in that it doesn't just say something about, or potentially say something about, how the general election could go, but about how people feel about the mayoral role itself. And because obviously in the West Midlands, it's quite an unusual situation where Andy Street is our Conservative mayor, but very much tries to pitch himself at the like at least Tory light, yes. If not, sometimes even just fully distancing himself from the party. And he kind of laid the groundwork for that. Well, he has the whole time, I think, since he's been in office, but last year especially, he's quite high profile, going against Rishi Sunak on HS2 and that kind of thing. Yeah. But yeah, in terms of the national coverage, I think you're right. It always tends to draw on what the implications could be for the country as a whole. When I interviewed Richard Parker 2 weeks ago, he said that was last week. And I think it was a week after the first poll result had come out, which put him significantly ahead. They've tempered since, like more recent polls have been a little bit have been much closer actually. But he said that at that point, that was when he started getting the Nationals ringing him up, which is quite interesting because obviously he's an unknown. So a relative unknown anyway, and doesn't have the profile. So you can kind of sense people thinking, or the Nationals thinking, oh, we need to get a sense of who this guy is.
And there's been quite a bit of sort of local media coverage, obviously yourself, but but more generally, the various outlets. Have they been active in both in covering and also, organising their own stuff?
Yeah, there has actually. I think we've got quite high quality political reporters in the West Midlands. That not enough of them because obviously resources waned.
Yeah, exactly. That's a bigger story, isn't it?
Yeah. But yeah, Rob Mayer at the BBC is always very plugged into what's happening with the mayor and the election, and Lewis Warner at ITV, and BBC Live, and Birmingham Live, and the Express and Star are also pretty hot on it too. I think Birmingham Live did a hustings. I didn't have the resource, unfortunately, to organise something similar, but yeah, Jane Haynes, who I think's been on here with you, is very across it.
Interesting. Right, Rob, give us the sort of, again, Tees Valley is probably the standout one in terms of national coverage for similar reasons that the West Midlands is, right? They're trying to draw a story that tells us something about the bigger, broader kind of national picture. So your reflections on that, but just the general local national media interest coverage, what's the reflections on that?
I'd say you're right that the Tees Valley has garnered significantly more national coverage than any of the other mayoral races in the north of England. I mean, I've seen it suggested that if Ben Houchen and also Andy Street were to lose, which actually looks quite unlikely now that both of those things were to happen, that would trigger a huge loss of support for Sunak and might even force him to call an early election. So I think maybe it's being seen as a bit of a referendum on the Conservatives more generally, and levelling up as a concept in the north of England, because Lord Houchen is the the so-called poster boy of Boris Johnson's levelling up agenda. He's a very pragmatic politician. He's done some quite non-conservative things like buying up an airport with taxpayers' money. So the feeling is, I think that if he can't succeed, then that is potentially the end of levelling up in the north, and all the red wall seats that we saw go from Labour to the Conservatives in 2019, they are all going to go back to Labour. So there's a lot of conclusions potentially being drawn from this, not all of which I think are fair to draw, because I think Ben Houchen is setting himself up as, in a similar way to Andy Street, quite distinct from the National Party. So I've seen a lot more national coverage of Tees Valley than anywhere else. There hasn't been loads of coverage of the North East. Maybe it's just a little bit too far away to cover, and it doesn't sort of fit neatly into a box. I think there's a bit of interest there about Jamie Driscoll as a sort of unusual candidate, and not much in York or North Yorkshire either. Although obviously it is interesting that is Rishi Sunak's constituency, so he could potentially be defeated on his own doorstep there, which would be quite a good story. In terms of
locality, though, Rob, how's the sort of, is the Tees Valley locality, the media there, have they been doing quite a bit? Have the Northeast crowd been doing quite a bit?
There's been so in the Northeast, for example, the Chronicle and Journal, who are the local newspapers, they did a hustings of the 6 candidates, which I chaired, and they I'd have to pay credit to the Chronicle and Journal, actually, because they recognise that there is a bit of a job of work to do to raise awareness of the mayoral election, because it's a new mayoralty. It hasn't previously existed. Like, tell people what it is, why it matters, who the candidates are. So they've been doing a lot of stuff. Like, there's also been the BBC locally as well, as in London, have organised hustings in most of the mayoral areas, and the Manchester Evening News have organised hustings as well. So there has been a lot of good local stuff going on. I think also in the Tees Valley there have been national reporters like Jen Williams at the Financial Times, who has taken an interest in the controversies involving the Tees Works regeneration project, which has meant that maybe more people know about the Tees Valley than might otherwise have done.
Exactly. Very interesting. I mean, the point you make about a job of work to be done to raise the awareness of the Metro Mayor, full stop, whoever's doing the job, or whoever wants to do the job, just raising the awareness amongst the public that there is such a thing as the Metro Mayor, and that they should, to the extent that they can or will, to engage with it, I think is definitely it's never ended in some respects, but definitely needed in this respect. Dave, you say something about, both Kate and Rob have alluded to it, but in terms of how the 2 main candidates, I suppose, have positioned themselves relative to their party, because we did a bit of polling, which seemed to suggest that people were more inclined or marginally more inclined to think about the person rather than necessarily the party when they were doing when they were making some decisions about candidates. And it's been an interesting one that in some places party doesn't feature, but in other places party features quite a bit. So to what extent, is Sadiq Khan very much the Labour candidate and Susan Hall is very much the Conservative candidate, or not? How strong has the party affiliation been in the debate?
It's been one of the most interesting features of the campaign in London from that point of view, because Sadiq Khan has very much adhered himself to the Labour brand. I mentioned earlier that he has been enjoying pretty big opinion poll leads over Susan Hall, but in some cases, polling done with the same sample has found absolutely gigantic Labour leads in terms of generally over the Conservatives, in terms of general election voting intention. So in that sense, Sadiq Khan is trailing his party in London. And he has absolutely made a point of describing himself as the Labour candidate. And he has had all the big names from Labour nationally turning up to back him. Keir Starmer was at his campaign launch, quite a big event in Paddington. Rachel Reeves has been. A whole succession of shadow cabinet members have turned up and done events with him. A key theme of his campaign has been saying, just imagine how much better things are going to be if you've got a Labour mayor working with a Labour government later this year. And he's got a point, because relations between Sadiq Khan and the Conservative national government, particularly when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, were absolutely awful. So that's quite a strong thing for him. Interestingly, Susan Hall has insofar as she is able to, distance herself from conservatism. Now, it's really quite difficult for her to do that convincingly, because she is so archetypally a Tory, to use old-fashioned language, a Tory lady. She sees herself, I think, in the Margaret Thatcher tradition. She's usually seen in true blue attire. So she's kind of totally Tory in terms of her sort of public persona. Even so, there has been an attempt, if you look at her website and her sort of social media stuff, there was an attempt to sort of brand her as an individual candidate, not so tightly affiliated to party. She was just called Susan, and very little sign of any Tory branding on her. So a complete contrast between the two, in an attempt to benefit from the respective popularities or unpopularities of their parties in London, or in the case of Susan Hall, to separate herself a bit from the unpopularity of the Tory brand in London.
That's interesting. Very interesting. Kate, you talked a little bit about, Andy essentially being as much known for being a former chief executive, John Lewis, as being the Conservative mayor of the West Midlands, as it were. I mean, so he's very deliberately sort of disassociated himself from Conservative. Just say a little bit more about that, but then how has he pitched himself vis-a-vis a Conservative government or a Labour government? Has he done anything on that? And then obviously has Richard Parker just, lent into, I'm very much the Labour candidate?
Yeah, Brand Andy is what it's called. So he's definitely, as I said before, like, it's not unusual for him to be kind of Tory shy, and his leaflets, I think, for as long as he's been campaigning, have been green rather than blue, that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, he's definitely pitching himself as, I think the focus of his campaign has been defend the record, or remind people of the record, i.e. what he's achieved in 2 terms, and that there's more to be done. I think his catchphrase is something like lots done, more to do, something like that. So he's more positioning himself as this kind of independent person who's done a lot for the region, and judge me on my track record, not the party that I'm a member of. But he did get into hot water in a debate with Richard Parker on exactly that point, because he tried criticising Richard Parker for the Labour Party's kind of financial crisis in Birmingham City Council, saying Parker had really close relationships with those councillors, and the mediator had to say, well, you know, that's a bit hypocritical, isn't it? Which was like quite a key point of that debate. But yeah, in terms of Richard Parker's positioning himself, he's definitely gone quite full throttle against Street, and trying to remind people he is a Tory and wears those stripes, and he's been quite forthright in, I think, in particular, attacking Street for lying. He keeps mentioning that Street kind of takes credit for things that he hasn't done and that kind of thing. Sometimes more effective than others, I think, because Parker is not a career politician, or hasn't been in the environment for that long. He's not as used to those kind of debates, so it's a little bit hit and miss.
Yeah, no, quite. But it's, you know, it's interesting the extent to which they're drawing on, you know, the bigger brand. I mean, both in Khan's case, where the brand is actually stronger than his own sort of personal.
Yeah.
I would assume that's similar in the West Mids, right? The Labour brand is obviously much stronger than Richard Parker's brand, whereas actually Andy's brand is probably higher than the Conservative brand at the moment in the West Mids.
Definitely, and Parker is definitely quite heavily leaning on the fact that it looks like Labour are going to win a general election, and very visible about his relationship with Keir Starmer, and the fact that he regularly attends shadow cabinet meetings, for example. So there's a lot of that kind of talk.
Interesting. Rob, let's do Tees Valley first. Is Ben Houchin the Conservative candidate of the Tees Valley, very obviously, or is he just, you know, Ben Houchin for Tees Valley?
Well, very much the latter, I would say. It's kind of interesting because in the last few years, he and Rishi Sunak have been, you'd have to say they were allies, because Sunak has a constituency that borders onto the Tees Valley, and you know, some of the big things that have benefited the Tees Valley have very much been driven by Rishi Sunak. So the move of the Treasury, the creation of a Northern HQ for the Treasury in Darlington in Ben Houchin's patch, that was very much a Houchin idea. The creation of Freeport, so these huge areas with low tax and low regulation, there's a massive one in the Tees Valley. That is very much a Sunak idea. So the two are seen as very much bedfellows, but I think you wouldn't necessarily know that from looking at Houchin's media output of late. Like, he has made it quite plain that he wants voters to judge him on his own perceived accomplishments in terms of the airport and jobs and so forth, and that they shouldn't judge the chaos in the Conservative Party. I mean, I think I've got an interesting, this is not in the Tees Valley, but in North Yorkshire, I got a good source quote from a local Conservative today who said that right now Margaret Thatcher is more popular in Argentina than Rishi Sunak is in the north of England, which I think gives you an idea of the context that like the Ben Houchin are trying to fight against. So I think we haven't seen Sunak on the campaign trail very much in the north of England for precisely those reasons. So I think, yeah, he's very much trying to paint a picture of himself as his own man.
Yeah, and in the northeast, obviously the main battle is between former Labour, current Labour. I mean, you've said a little bit about, you know, Jamie Driscoll kind of leaning into and fighting the machine. You know, to what extent is Kim sort of essentially very strongly the Labour candidate and Jamie is the very strongly independent, or is it all a bit of a blur?
No, I think that is very well. I think Jamie Driscoll definitely wants voters to see that as the choice, because I think you know, there is a sense that in the northeast that, you know, Labour still hasn't convinced all voters that they have a really strong offering, and so I think Jamie Driscoll is really trying to ram home the fact that he is independent of the party, that you know, a vote for him is showing people that the northeast do things differently. That's all over his you know, his election manifesto and so forth. And yeah, Kim had loads of visits from Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves. And then there's quite a few northeast MPs who've come up to support as well. So that, yeah, I think that is a very clear discrepancy between the two of them.
Yeah. Okay. And presumably in Yorks and North Yorks, just very quickly, the Conservative candidate is the Conservative candidate. Is that right?
Yes. I mean, it was pointed out today that Keane Duncan, the Conservative, doesn't have any mentions of Rishi Sunak on his website. I mean, I'm pretty sure I saw a post of him posing with Rishi Sunak on his Facebook page, which I guess isn't surprising given that Sunak is a constituency MP. But yeah, it's interesting with Keane Duncan. He is taking an approach of doing things perhaps in similar vein to Ben Houchen that might not be traditionally associated with a Conservative politician. For example, he has announced that he wants to buy up and renovate the Grand Hotel in Scarborough, which it was a hotel that Winston Churchill stayed at in its glory days, but these days it's owned by Britannia Hotels and it's known as one of the worst hotels in the country. It's in terrible shape, and Keane Duncan has said he wants to buy it and restore it to its former glory, which is not very Conservative, and it's slightly, there were questions about how he's going to be able to do that. I think he wants to set up a mayoral development corporation, as Ben Houchen has done, to facilitate that, and he wants to create North Yorkshire's first mutual bank, which again is not something you would traditionally associate with the Conservative. So I think his brand is quite different to a traditional Conservative brand, and maybe that is a reflection of the relatively low standing of the Conservatives in the North in general.
Very good, very good. Kate, obviously during the election period, there's been a wide range of issues being discussed. But if you had to pick sort of one or two that are kind of very much, they're at the top of the list in terms of recurrence, but also where there's most contention or debate, what would be your shortlist, one or two?
Yeah, transport, which I think even your survey found that was like
so
the
transport
most...
was the one that people could identify the most with, and also what they expected, the Metro Met, to the extent that they had any expectations. Transport is the one they expect them to be doing something around.
Yeah, and I think people, there's just a really obvious way how that impacts people's everyday lives, isn't it? So definitely in terms of the public, that's probably the one that strikes the strongest chord, whatever the saying is. And there's also where the two kind of main candidates deviate quite significantly. So Parker has, in fact, I think it was from the very beginning when he announced his candidacy, or when Labour announced his candidacy, he said, I back bus franchising, just like Andy Burnham has done in Manchester, bring the buses back into public control. And that is a huge issue in the West Midlands because we don't have, that's the main method of public transport. I think the statistic is something like 25% of people, for people in the West Midlands, that their only mode of transport is the bus. And it has been chaotic in recent years, I think for quite a long time. And Andy Street's position has always been, we've launched an assessment to see what we should do with the buses, and one of the possible outcomes of that will be bus franchising. Let's wait until the assessment to see what's the best option. In the meantime, look at all the good things I've done. He always makes this claim that he's kept bus prices as low as they possibly can, and the lowest in the regions anyway in the country. But that assessment conveniently comes out in June, so after the election. So that is something, that whoever the mayor is will deal with then. So I think that's one of the key issues. Another one would probably be, I'm not sure how much the public registers housing as an issue, but definitely in terms of what Parker and Street have also come to heads on, but more they have more similar approaches, is housing, and particularly social housing, the kind of battle to pledge to build as much social housing as possible. Yeah,
that's interesting. Rob, Tees Valley, what's the big issue?
Well, Ben Houchen wants to make it the airport, Teesside Airport, which, as I mentioned, he bought into public ownership. It was on the verge of closing in 2017. He bought it with public money, and it continues to make a loss, this airport, and it's still not at the point where it's making money. So more taxpayers' money is going into it, and but it appears that the Labour opponent of Ben Houchen was not as supportive of buying the airport as perhaps he might have been at the time. So Ben Houchen is trying to make a lot of political capital on that. I mean, one thing I'm kind of interested in the Tees Valley, I've seen a lot of criticism of the Labour candidate for not attacking Houchen more on sort of trust issues, because there have been some big controversies in the Tees Valley. Obviously, there's this whole row over Tees Works and the secretive way in which it was run, and there was a big report which revealed there wasn't any corruption there, but there was a long list of governance failings. And I'm seeing a lot of remarks on social media that Labour aren't making enough of a meal, not attacking that story enough, and also the issue of mass die-off of crabs and other shellfish off the coast of Teesside. So there are some issues that Labour could be having a real go at Ben Houchen over, but they seem to be doing a relatively timid kind of campaign, focusing on things like the high streets, no real bold policy.
Why do you think that
I
is?
feel like it's quite surprising.
Why do you think that is?
I don't know. I wonder whether they think that Ben Houchen is such a polarizing figure that they don't that perhaps it's better for their candidate to have a bit more of a sort of emollient, softly spoken approach, and that will appeal to the electorate more. But I mean, it doesn't seem to be working because they're 7 points behind. So I think if Labour don't win in the Tees Valley, I think there will be a bit of a post-mortem about that, because it did seem like a very winnable seat for them.
Yeah. And in the northeast, I mean, what's the issue, and B, is there much difference between McGuinness and Driscoll?
I mean, there are a lot of things that everyone agrees on. Similar to the West Midlands, transport is a massive issue. There's a host of transport problems that need fixing in the northeast, like the state of the Tyne and Wear Metro needs to be improved. The rail links are not what they could be. The A1 in Northumberland needs dualling. So there's a lot of agreement on those kind of things. Child poverty also is everyone says is a big important priority, because I think the northeast is one of the only areas of the country where child poverty is actually going up. I mean, I think it would be fair to say that Jamie Driscoll's approach to quite a lot of these issues is probably a bit more radical and sort of more of a socialist approach than Kim McGuinness. I saw that he would like to ban all junk food advertising on I think on the Tyne and Wear Metro, which I think Jamie Oliver has supported him over. So there's a few areas of difference. I'll just tell you about one quite amusing policy idea which the Liberal Democrat has come up with. There's a guy called Aidan King, who is a local doctor at Newcastle's Royal Victoria Infirmary, and his plan is to build the country's largest onshore wind farm on rural land across County Durham and Northumberland, and he advertises this with the unconventional slogan "I've got wind," which he brings out at every hustings and always brings the house down.
Brilliant! Wow, that's what I call innovation.
It's memorable. Although I wouldn't have mentioned him had it not been for that. So it's clearly
quite exactly. You've got to get attention one way or another when you're very much the third candidate, right? Or maybe the fourth candidate, I don't know, but you know what I mean? Very good. Very good. People on the call, I bet we didn't expect to hear that, but there we are. Come to Centre of Cities events. Who knows what's going to happen? Dave, what's the big issue in London, and is it the same issue with the biggest bit of contention between Cairn and Hall?
Well, I expect you will have read and heard about the ultra-low emission zone expansion, the ULEZ. Okay, so Susan Hall's campaign has basically in this order: crime, ULEZ, crime, ULEZ, crime, ULEZ, crime, ULEZ. And then she talks a bit about housing, too many skyscrapers, and she wants to deregulate, as it were, the mayor's master planning document, which is kind of fairly orthodox Labour Conservative divide. And she's also spoken about London's nighttime economy, which mayors don't really have any control over because they don't control licensing. But she feels that the mayor's night czar is somebody that she can criticise, and there are various things that she's advocated to try and revive London's nighttime economy, which is very important to London and indeed the whole country. On Sadiq Khan's side, he has defended his record. He's fought on his record, but quite carefully. So he hasn't been talking about ULEZ, but he has been talking about air quality and saying that he has taken big steps to improve air quality. We have to remember that the ULEZ has been expanded twice. It was originally just in central London, and it was a Boris Johnson policy which Sadiq Khan implemented after he became mayor. Sadiq Khan then expanded it out to the North and South Circular Road, so covering slightly less than half Greater London. And interestingly, Susan Hall opposed that, and she's now changed her mind, decided that was okay. But it's the further expansion that came in last August to cover the whole of Greater London that there's been a lot of aggravation about. So Sadiq Khan is talking about air quality in a sort of general sense. He wants green and Lib Dem type voters to lend him their votes. You see, environment is big with those kinds of voters. The other one is his free school meals policy. This has had very, very little national newspaper coverage, but I think will probably be quite a strong policy for him. He's basically universalized provision of free school meals for primary school children all across London. Yeah. Some of them would have been eligible for that already, but he has, from his own funds, he's meant that every primary school child in a state school in London gets a free school meal. And I think that would probably be a very popular. In fact, I did some polling with Redfield and Wilton, and I think it's the only poll that has asked Londoners specifically what they think of that policy, and there was 70% in favour, which is, a lot. Yeah. So only in percentage terms, a relatively limited number of people will benefit from it directly, but there is a lot of general support for the idea. So he's been playing that's a big card for him. He's also talking about housing in terms of council house delivery. So some of the London's portion of the affordable housing fund from national government, he has allocated to local authorities, and there's been a bit of a council house building boom. Remember, that's growing up in a council house is part of his identity as a politician, isn't it? Yes. That and his dad being a bus driver. Yeah. So he's big on that. And on the crime thing, he's saying, I'm the person who is bringing about reform of the Metropolitan Police. I took the bull by the horns, and I forced out the previous commissioner. Obviously, his critics would say, well, you should have done that a long time ago. Yeah. But so those are his big ones. Plus, I'm Labour.
Yeah. Well. Yeah, so we might get a Labour. Mm. Yeah, no, I think it's interesting. That's a fantastic sort of whiz around, but nevertheless, some of the detail. Let's use the last 10 minutes just to kind of take a step back, zoom out. As I said at the beginning, we're going to have 10 places with mayors. Well, obviously, we've got another 2 already that will go to the poll next here, west of England and Cambridge and Peterborough. 50% of the population covered by metro mayors, etc. Taking a step back, not just through the campaign, but just your more general reflections on metro mayors and the state of devolution and what that might mean, given we've got a general election coming up, which, if the polls are to believe, highly likely that we get some change of government. How decisive, we don't know. Kate, what's your kind of broader, bigger picture perspectives? You're in the detail of West Mids, but what's your kind of reflections on that kind of broader, bigger picture?
Sorry, how do you mean in terms of its relationship to national politics, or
Yeah, so I think, well, partly national politics, but I think, given where we are now with the mayors, we've had them for a while. There's a lot of them. They cover a lot of areas. I mean, what would be your reflections about in the next parliament, I suppose? What role do you envisage the mayors generally playing? The significance of devolution based on what we've had.
I mean, it looks to me as though it's here to stay, and devolution is only going to become more of a thing from my perspective anyway. It's not really my area of like expertise, but we can already see both the major parties. I mean, the Tories arguably started it with Boris Johnson, and then well, depends how far back you go, but but this like the devolution deals that the current mayors have, and it was a major part of Labour when Keir Starmer came to Dudley to launch his local election campaign. Further devolution was a major theme of his speech. So, I mean, whether or not that's, I think the criticism leveled at him is whether he's explained how he would fund it. So I don't know how achievable it is another question.
Yeah.
But in terms of an issue that's here to stay, I think it definitely is. And I think Labour's even talked about having, I'm not 100% sure if it's just Labour mayors or all Metro mayors, but having them at regular cabinet meetings as well if they get into power. So yeah.
Yeah, that sort of idea of a cabinet of mayors or a coalition of mayors seems to be raising, in terms of its prominence. Rob, your reflection. I mean, whether Labour wins Tees Valley or whether it wins West Mids or it doesn't, it's still a case that the majority of the Metro mayors will be Labour, and it's likely, all things being equal, that we get a Labour government at some point this year, and majority to be decided. What do you think about the dynamics between lots of Labour mayors and a Labour government? How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, it's interesting because in the last few years, I would say the prevailing dynamic has been a majority sort of Labour group of northern mayors coming together as one. You see this quite often to criticise the Conservative government, whether it's on HS2 or other transport issues or things like lockdown restrictions. Like it's quite a go-to move for the likes of Andy Burnham, Tracy Brabin, Steve Rotherham, Oliver Coppard to band together and say this is what the North wants. Ben Houchen never joins in. He always he does his own thing in the Tees Valley. So I guess under a Labour government, we'll see less of that because they won't be wanting to air their dirty laundry in public in quite the same way. I see that Sue Gray, the new Chief of Staff for Labour, has struck up a good relationship with the Labour mayor. So I imagine if there are disagreements, they'll be more likely to happen in private. I was quite interested to see, though, that Andy Burnham and Steve Rotherham have a book out, which I'll give a plug. I think it's called Head North, came out in the last month or two, and it's their sort of journey from they both grew up in quite close areas to each other in Liverpool, but obviously they became Metro mayors in Greater Manchester and Liverpool City region. So this book is about their journey, but it is also a relatively radical manifesto for the things that they would like to do to rewire the country, and these things go quite a lot further than Labour's current policy. Things like replacing the Lords with a Senate of nations and regions, and getting rid of the whip system, and going a lot further on net zero jobs than Keir Starmer wants to. So I wonder whether a story under a Labour government will be contributions from Andy Burnham that are perceived to be unhelpful in his role as King of the North. I mean, I think more widely, Labour has made the right noises about wanting to continue the devolution agenda. They seem to be in a similar place to the Conservatives on that. Angela Rayner gave a speech in Manchester about how they want to give power back to elected people in the North, which Michael Gove could easily have given that same speech. But I think it will be interesting to see whether Labour can overcome its natural sort of inclination towards centralisation. Like, it's all very well saying you want to hand more power out to Metro mayors when you're in opposition, but then when you've got the levers to pull in Whitehall yourself, like, do you want to give that away to someone who might criticise you? Like, so I think the proof of the pudding will be in the eating when it comes to actually a Labour government and how actually committed they are to devolution.
That's interesting. Yeah, very good. Dave, a sort of final thought from you. I mean, on that, I mean, London at various points has had a Labour mayor and a Labour government, a Conservative mayor and a Conservative government, and it's had, Labour mayor, Conservative government, vice versa. So it's had a bit of everything. So any thought on that? But I'm also interested in your sort of final reflection on, this will be the seventh. I think this will be the seventh time, right, that Londoners go to elect their Metro mayor or their mayor. What can we learn about the sort of evolution of that mayoralty over time? You've been watching this from the off, so just what might we learn from that? Seventh iteration versus, in some instances, the first iteration.
I think it's worth just mentioning in passing that Sadiq Khan is the first mayor of London who has been mayor of London with a national government of the opposite party throughout.
Yes, that's
one of the things that he's had to deal with.
Yeah.
I mean, I think in London we sort of full strength Devo nerd freaks down here feel that we feel that London is due a devolution rev up. We need people to start thinking about what London needs, because there hasn't been a great deal of change since the original in 1999 and the first election in 2000. Straight after this gathering, I'm going to be jumping on a train and going off to an event that I've organised with the Institute for Government, where we're going to discuss this whole issue. Does London need a new devolution deal? And it's one of those questions to which the answer is yes.
Yeah.
I think that the London mayoralty has become more established as it's gone on. If I'm just looking at the turnout figures, the highest ever. So the first election was less than 35%. Then we got the celebrity election of 2008, Boris v. Ken Mark I. We went up to 45. 2016 was the first mayoral election where we had two non-celebrity politicians representing the two biggest parties, Sadiq Khan and Zach Goldsmith for the Conservatives, and the expectation was that turnout would sink, but actually it produced the biggest turnout yet, 46%. And even 3 years ago, the COVID delayed 2021 election, when again there was a reason to think that it might drop quite depressingly, it held up pretty well at 42%. So be interesting to see what it is this time. Yes. So there is. I think we're at the point where London devolved regional government to London is appreciated, recognised, and it just needs some new powers and some new impetus to take it forward further. And I know that there are hopes, and Rob's note of caution is duly noted by me. There are hopes that with a Labour government there will be some more powers for London. It's a question of how we're going to get them, I think.
Yes, very good.
Does that answer your question sufficiently?
No, you have. You certainly have.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's 3 o'clock. Sorry. So we could definitely go on, but not least we need to leave Dave go to talk about what you would see in a new devolution agreement, and obviously colleagues need to continue to cover the races that are in the final 48 hours. We shall see what the results will be, and undoubtedly there'll be lots of debates and discussions about what it all means, both at the local level and at the national level. So, and we'll be back, I think, sometime next week to have a look at that and see some of the results and what that might mean. So, but for now, thank you to Kate, to Dave, and to Rob. Thank you all for being on the call, and we shall be back in touch shortly. Take care and stay safe. Thanks for being.
Thank you. Very nice to see you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.